Well, ladies and gentlemen, very, very good to see so many people here today. And as part of the wider conference on digital ethics, I think that there is nothing more, in some ways, ethical than the ability and the importance and priority that we take to decarbonize and meet net zero and really drive exponential change in the systems, not just in energy, but energy being sort of a bit of a focus of this particular sort of breakout group. But we have quite a array of great speakers here today. And I would sort of welcome some questions that you would put in the chat box, and I will pick them up as we go along. But firstly, I'm very, very pleased to welcome Eve Joseph. And Eve, would you just explain a little bit about your role?
Yes, of course. Thank you so much, Laura. Hi, everyone. As Laura mentions, my name's Eve Joseph, and I am the Sustainability Customer Lead at Microsoft. What does that actually mean? My job is to help the global capacity of Microsoft have discussions with their customers around how technology can support them in achieving their own sustainability goals. So it's quite a far-reaching role, and I get to work across a number of different industries to help think about how sustainability goals can be achieved, but predominantly utilising technology. But I'm based in the UK. Yeah, so that's me.
Wonderful. And Greg Jackson, who's Chief Executive and founder of Octopus Energy, who's really taken a sort of lead in energy when it comes to technology and digitalisation. Greg.
Thank you. I don't think I've got a lot more to add. Hey, look, basically, I think I started in tech in well, before most people on this call were born, writing video games in the 1980s. But, you know, as a team that started Octopus Energy, we previously worked with a whole pile of companies building platforms to take people through the digital revolution. And I think what we spotted was energy was the last significant sector globally that hadn't yet been through that. The opportunity is colossal. I think technology will let us drive a renewable, cleaner system dramatically faster because it lets us capitalize on green electrons when they're abundant and handle times when they're less abundant. I'd love to talk about digital ethics in the broadest sense. So I'm really excited to be part of this today. Thank you.
Fantastic. And Stephen Steer from Ofgem, who's really been driving through a sort of new energy and enthusiasm from the regulator, from the energy regulator, to digitalise the energy system, which then in many ways enables and allows Greg to optimise the customer experience and the decarbonised choices. So, Stephen.
Yeah, hi Laura, hi everybody. It's lovely to be here, and you're right. I was going to make points to that effect actually as part of the introduction. That I can't and don't know if I ever will be able to take credit for actually delivering the digitalized energy system and actually doing the work for everybody. But I think there is also a really important role for effective governance in the modern world of digitalization and making sure that the way that we present digital services across sectors to the world is going to be really crucial to things like net zero, and I'm sure we'll talk about that more today. But yes, regulation of data is my bag, as it were.
Fantastic. And I know also that you're very interested in the ethics and the issue about sort of the public interaction with data. So we'll come on to that later. And a fellow commissioner on the IPPR Environmental Justice Commission with me is Dr. Emily Chakra, director of Cambridge Zero, which is really driving and in many ways coordinating a sort of wider debate, not just energy, on the whole net zero journey and some of the key issues that we need to address. So welcome, Emily.
Thank you, Laura. Yes, and actually the other thing that I've been involved in recently, which is very relevant to what we're going to be talking about today, is a Royal Society report, which came out last week on the role that digital technologies can play in the path to net zero. So I very much recommend anybody. It's a very detailed report, but lots and lots of interesting things in it. I recommend that people have a look at that report.
No, it was a really great report, and some people involved in the Energy Data Task Force were quite sort of engaged and involved, and it's really sort of set a standard for us all. So I just wanted to sort of outline where we need to be looking at, and in many ways the Royal Society report talks about that, and we've got, you know, with Greg and Eve, actually things being put into practice, and that is what net zero really means. I mean, people might question this, but from my perspective, it is not a consumption objective. It is absolutely about changing our whole approach to how we look at our economy and moving from a consumption economy to an optimization economy. And particularly when we're looking at the multiple players that need to engage, so whether particularly in energy, when you've got EV cars, but actually right across the so-called carbon supply chain, at what points? I look for carbon keys, the bits of where carbon intensity can be unlocked and decarbonized, that actually allows other people to take easy actions rather than difficult. So in some ways, the digitalization agenda strikes me as being right the way across the supply chain, from a consumer facing, in many ways, assistance and in automated assistance, right the way through every part of supply chains. And I think that's a really important element. And that's why, in many ways, this debate about ethics is extremely important, because it will create all sorts of opportunities, but the distortions and some of the potential misuse, hopefully not, but potential, is there. There is quite a potential for that, which comes to sort of regulation, of course. But so I just wanted to sort of kick off with, where do you see the sort of the low-hanging fruit for the introduction and real turbocharging of digitalization to help us sort of really accelerate towards net zero, and obviously considering some much more sort of aggressive targets, all very, very welcome. I mean, Emily, from the Royal Society's report, where did they see that some of the most important interventions were required?
Well, I think you really put your finger on where a key issue is there, Laura. So one key intervention clearly is on the skills agenda. That was one of the things that was highlighted in the report and is clearly important. And that skills both in terms of skilling people for the jobs associated with that digitalization, but also skilling people in terms of, on the consumer side of things, making sure that people have the ability to be able to, you know, if we're putting smart meters into people's homes, that they understand how to use them, etc. So there's the skill. One set of things is around the skills thing. Another set of things is around, if you like, the interoperability of data. So if you're developing technologies, and perhaps Greg can talk about this a little bit as well, I suspect it's a key issue in the energy sector, making sure that people can be able to easily access, but then be able to use that data, is another critical issue. And that's not just in terms of building technologies that are going to be able to help us, as you say, unlock certain aspects of that supply chain, but it's also around disclosures of data. So when we're looking at the disclosure, you know, there's been a really important advance over the last couple of years in terms of corporate disclosures around climate-related data, and we're now looking wanting to see that extended through supply chains. But that again requires ensuring that we've got the mechanisms in place to allow that.
And when you look at interoperability, which I think we're all extremely keen on, there is an element of interoperability, not just within sectors, but cross-sector. And that particular dynamic is quite complicated. I say this about the energy sector and not about Greg or Stephen, but some people in the energy sector don't get out very much, i.e. they don't really meet anybody from other sectors. Greg, from your perspective, what do you think are the sort of key areas that we need to really sort of turbocharge?
I'll talk about energy unless anything else comes to mind, because it's the area I know best. Although good news, Laura, is 5 years ago, I didn't know anything about energy. And so hopefully you've got out a little bit. Look, interoperability, I think, is absolutely key. And I think it's hugely, there's a huge lack of understanding. One of the challenges in society is the people that write the rules tend to be ones who are less familiar with the cutting edge, the bleeding edge, or even the mainstream of technology. Far too often, I'll have conversations with policymakers and others, which start with an assumption that young people use Facebook, whereas most of us know that grannies use Facebook to look at photos of grandkids and to broadcast opinions. My 96-year-old grand certainly falls in that category. Now, that's not to say every single one of them, but the point being that increasingly tech is ubiquitous. What really matters then is understanding what's happening in the world of emergent tech. So, for example, take a company like Octopus, where we use real-time pricing to enable people to charge an electric vehicle when the wind's blowing and the sun's shining. This is a Pareto improvement for society. The ability to grab low marginal cost green electrons and use them rather than just put them into the blancmange of the energy system, turning them off, from time to time if you've got too many, is a fundamental mind shift. Now, to do that, we can either have lots of walled gardens like the Apple ecosystem, or we can have a really open system populated by APIs. And yet most of the time when I write a deck that includes the word API, I have to explain it. And I think helping people understand, they'll talk about these things, they'll talk about interoperability without actually having kind of a grasp of it. So I guess the first bit for me is really working hard to have a more educated leadership in the realm of public policy, so that they can better kind of make judgments about directions to travel in sectors. I think concomitant with that, there's fascinating data, isn't it? Something like 86% of people say, they want to guard their private data. And yet, behaviorally, what we find is they'll give it all up in return for a few pictures of cats doing cute things on Facebook. So there are some really interesting paradoxes between what people say about data and how they actually behave. And I think it's incumbent upon companies, policymakers, and those influencing the space to think hard about these topics. For example, we can use smart meter data to identify people who've got leaky homes and are, kind of burning too much carbon to achieve comfort in winter. Indeed, for some people, that is the difference between having a warm house and a cold house, because they can't afford to just keep the heating on. But, they may simultaneously have chosen to not give us half-hourly access, not knowing we could help them like that. And you want to look back over several winters to see what's happening in different weather patterns to really understand these problems. So by the time someone realizes the opportunity is there, maybe they've already burnt the data. So I think really complex questions about education for policymakers, and then making difficult decisions in conjunction with consumers. Because, despite the fact that, Facebook's been around, 15 years or longer, people still clearly have this paradox between what they say and do in the world of data.
I think it's really
sorry,
important.
Laura, can I just come back very quickly on the point that you made as well about this connecting between different parts of the system as well, because one of the other really key recommendations of the report was to set up a net zero task force for digitalization that did span different government departments, exactly to speak to the point that you were raising there, Laura.
And it is the integration of the economy in its wider sense. But one thing, Greg, I think is really important about what you said is, I talk about digital literacy. I mean, we're not asking policymakers to be, sort of digital experts, but there needs to be some literacy around what it means. And far too many, and I don't know whether even Stephen find this, but actually when you look at businesses, you talk about their digital strategy and they bring out their IT guy who's great at rolling out Microsoft, no disrespect to Microsoft, but actually understanding digital business models, the interaction, all the rest of it. It actually needs to be disentangled from that sort of IT function, because I think there's a lot of melding of two very, very different outcomes. Greg was talking, Eve, about sort of consumers and their behavior and all the rest of it. You're obviously very much at the front end of what data and the interaction between customers and data is. And you're obviously also very empowered to drive not necessarily behavior change, but automated options for consumers. What are your insights on what the consumer opportunities are, but also what you think the risks and the sort of tensions are?
So I think you've kind of hit the nail on the head when we think about consumers. It's all around kind of digital literacy, and it's all about understanding the kind of precious nature of the data that we have. But consumers have a hell of a lot of power, especially buying power. So if consumers started to think about the power that they have to drive organizations to actually make change, the chances are organizations will start to make shifts. And, you can see it in Greg and creating Octopus Energy, the shift that you created in the energy sector, because consumers were asking for something much more aligned to their values. And I think what we're seeing with businesses, sorry, excuse my phone, what we're seeing with businesses and with consumers is their buying attitudes are changing, and especially when it comes to the environment. Now, the challenge we have, and bringing this back to ethics, is we have to make sure we are not excluding people from their buying choices, because at the moment, as I would call myself a conscious buyer, when you're buying something that has more sustainability credentials, right now it costs more money. And that is the biggest challenge we have as a business, is a lot of the change that is happening can cost more money. Now, there are obviously exceptions to the rule, of course. But I think there's an opportunity there for consumers to really utilize their buying power and think more about pushing businesses to make change. So, for example, our consumer products are mainly Surface and Xbox, and we are being pushed by our consumers to make sure that we make them as energy efficient and as made from sustainable materials as is possible. So we've got different work streams happening at the moment to try and encourage that. And then I think the other part of this is businesses taking their role in this very seriously. So you mentioned earlier about data. I'm not sure many consumers are aware of the data that they could give to businesses that would really make a difference. One of the articles I've been reading in preparation for today was the fact that actually our scientific data in the space of climate change is still limited. We have some data, but there's so much more that we could capture. But the only way we're going to capture it is if both businesses and consumers allow us to utilize that data in a meaningful way to make decisions. So I think there needs to be some kind of, whether it's regulatory, whether it's economical, however society needs to change behavior, we really need to start thinking about the power that is within our data and how we make it so that consumers understand what they're giving to companies.
I mean, that comes back down to a lot of issues around trust, doesn't it? And one of the issues for me always is that the default, that things that are so-called seen as green are seen as odd, sort of little leprechaun in the corner, right? Whereas actually green should be the normal, and we should in many ways highlight what is abnormal, which is, dirty, fossil, carbon. And in some ways we've almost got it as a sort of an elite branding rather than a universal, the default position. And I think there's a lot around that. But also what you're saying is that digitalization can drive, if built with trust, can drive democratization of choice. And I think that's very important when we look at it. If I to Stephen, because I mean, Eve talked about regulation and talked about how that regulatory model, and my proposition is that, the good should be the default and the less good should be the difficult choices. How do you see the journey that regulation is taking, and do you feel that we're going fast enough, or is there also an issue about literacy within regulation and the opportunities of digitalization?
So there's a few bits in there, Laura. I think there's already been excellent justice done to the data literacy discussion. I think I'll just acknowledge that, quite right, the regulator, just like all of the rest of the sector, and probably large chunks of society, everybody needs to improve their data literacy to take full advantage of the digitalisation opportunities. I would not pretend that it's any exception. The regulatory journey of change, I think, also has quite a similar, really important argument to it as well, which is that technology constraints around climate change, the needs for a much more dynamic and active system and such, is not limited to the market itself, but it's also informative to what effective governance looks like, and that includes regulation. There is plenty of opportunity to change and evolve what best practice regulatory rules look like, and part of this. An example of this is the way that digitalization is a response to heightened complexity in the marketplace. You need improved augmentation for us to keep making good decisions. And that is true for regulation, that it's no longer practical to govern and oversee a marketplace that has become much more complex than the one you were accustomed to in the past. You need better tools, you need better methodologies. And that, I hope, is showing some signs of singing through, in that we found ways recently with digitalization to adopt and really make real some of the things that have always been in our ethos about principles-based approaches to regulation and more adaptive regulatory rules. And some of our most recent work is really taking hold in that fashion. You asked if it's quick enough. Well, the challenge I always give to regulation is that it's easy to do good because you're the only one doing the job. It's really hard to do best, and so I would never try and claim that we're moving fast enough or changing quick enough, because actually we have some of the same challenge the energy networks and other parts of the sector have, which is that we have no real benchmark for what quick enough looks like, and every day we run slower, the environment and people's livelihoods are affected. So we should always be finding the next opportunity to go quicker and quicker.
Just sort of picking up on also Eve's point about sort of trust, and how can regulation and in many ways the architecture of governance, where it's absolutely crucial that we don't crush the innovation or the opportunities of digitalization, but where do you see the risks, and are there mitigations to sort of the either abuse or the algorithmic, as we've seen in education this year, the algorithmic distortions of how digitalization can impact?
So
We don't talk about the Department of Education too much when we talk about algorithms.
So I've got I suppose a top-down and a bottom-up thought process around this. From the top-down, I'd highlight that different things work for different people. That's the nature of markets and the purpose of different services, and that's as true for trust as it is for any other type of element of service. So different people will respond better to different types of people, giving them information and sharing. And so you need to make sure you've got options. It's not just all on one party to solve any given problem. From the bottom up, some of our most recent regulatory rules are around setting expectations, not only that data should be more open for the sector, but also that the methods and algorithms, as you say, for how people come to positions with their data and their decision making, also really need to be as open as is practical. If you are and this really just points to a normal regulatory challenge in anything that's monopolistic. You need to maximize opportunities for scrutiny and accountability, and if you can achieve that, then you will grow things like trust.
No, absolutely. And Eve, I wonder whether you've seen, I mean, you obviously, as a company of global, and I wonder whether you've seen sort of methodologies and sort of approaches to regulation that look very specifically at the ethical dimension and how one can balance the ethics with the freedom to innovate and be dynamic.
I think it kind of varies depending on what sort of organization you are. So because we are, like you say, a global entity, we have to think really strongly about the different organizations we're working with and the data we hold. So many customers trust us with their data on our cloud platform. So we have to think very stringently and follow regulatory approaches very stringently. But there are so many, and especially in the space of climate change, there are so many small organizations, so startup organizations that are coming out, especially in carbon capture, where they're kind of pushing the boundaries. And that's not just pushing the boundaries on innovation, they are pushing the boundaries on regulation as well, on what data they want to collect from both consumers, but actually also from the planet and how to share it. And I think what I'm seeing is a balance between innovation and regulation. And to Stephen's point, making sure regulation doesn't hold back innovation, but still allows those organizations to build trust in what it is that they're trying to deliver. So I guess the biggest thing here that is glaringly obvious in the discussion that we're having is transparency. Is if we've got innovation and we've got good regulation that has been created very well by the different government entities and organizations across the globe, what we have to do as businesses is we have to therefore be transparent to allow that regulation to come to fruition and not allow us to stop the innovation. Because especially in carbon capture, and I'll use this as an example because we've recently just put out an RFP for 1 million tons of CO2 that we need to capture by the end of our financial year, which is June. And in that RFP, we thought we would get tens of, yeah, I know it's, yeah, we're just going to do it. It's going to be fine. Going to be fine. Yeah, absolutely. We thought we'd get tens of organizations, and we actually got hundreds of organizations come in, and they kind of came across like a, almost like a Gartner quadrant, where we had both natural technology, but then we also had innovative technology. So natural ones such like planting trees, carbon capture in the oceans and things like that. But then we also had technology, but they came across the two different spectrums. Massive organizations and then small startups from across the globe. And we wanted to make sure we were as inclusive as possible. But in doing that, we also had to make sure that those small startups we were working with adhered to the regulatory frameworks that we have to adhere to as a large organization. So I think to answer your question in a roundabout way is it comes down to transparency. And if we're going to get regulation that works with business as opposed to against it, we need to make sure that it allows innovation to grow, but in the right way that does build trust with the people that are working with it.
I mean, Greg, what would you advise in terms of regulation framework? I mean, it is important to have a sort of ethical underpinning of data and digitalization. But one thing I know we share is the issue that regulation actually sort of inhibits better outcomes through, in some ways, fear and sometimes not knowledge about what can be achieved.
Yeah, Laura, you're absolutely right. Thank you for that. I think the examples for me obviously often come from things we've already seen. So in energy, we have a whole pile of innovation available, I think, to bring, for example, decarbonised heating to people's homes or decarbonised transport. By the way, these are things that will help tackle the greatest problem humanity faces.
Yeah.
And yet, time and again, for example, I will be asked, well, this requires digital technology. How will, and the policymakers will use the stereotypes, how will old people cope with this? Or how, and genuinely, it's important we think about these, how will low-income households cope with this and so on? And I think those kind of questions very often act as a barrier to the innovation that we so desperately need to tackle the biggest problems. And now, if we'd asked before Apple launched the iPhone, how is this going to impact low-income households? It was £700 for the first year when it launched was the iPhone in the UK. We would never have had the iPhone. And that would be a great shame for all households because the iPhone very rapidly paved the way to what I colloquially call the $40 Android, that democratized data globally and led to low-income households in the UK having near ubiquitous access to the internet, not just in the UK, but around the world. So a lot of those kind of problems, and I get challenged time and again by regulators say, how are you going to solve this problem before we start the journey? And that's like standing looking at a chessboard before the game has started and someone saying, great, what's your mate move going to be? Well, look, we need to let this game play out. You can't imagine it all. We can think a couple of moves ahead and no more. A great example for me recently in where things have worked well was I was listening to Woman's Hour and it had Gina Martin. She was the campaigner that really led the call for the campaign for laws against upskirting in the UK. Now, when camera phones became ubiquitous, no regulator thought, hang on, these could be used for upskirting. But what we did well as a society was when the problem became apparent, was brought in a rule to deal with that problem. And we did it quickly. Maybe not quickly enough, but we did it quickly. And that's now, you know, a kind of a piece of legislation we can be proud of. And I think, therefore, it's a good example to me that says, look, you have to allow innovation to happen, but you have to be willing to act quickly and smartly when problems arise afterwards. If we try and solve the problems before, we'll be solving the wrong problem, and we will be tackling the great big challenges society faces.
No, I absolutely agree. And I do think that we've got a tendency to place all our social burdens, let's say in the energy sector, on poverty, which isn't an energy issue, it's an income issue. A technical term called crap housing, which isn't an energy problem, it is actually a housing issue. And all of these issues are all conflated because somebody didn't have a bucket to throw it at and said, oh, the energy sector can pick those things up. And actually, by doing that, we're not actually helping those families come out of those particular problems. So I absolutely agree. Emily, I was really interested in the, again, coming back to the Royal Society report, but one of the places that I've done quite a bit of research and worked quite closely with is Estonia. And Estonia declared in 2003 that it would become a digital government. And it has the most sophisticated consumer, in some ways, consent process. And let's say in the energy sector, what you do is you don't have to share your data with your smart meter, but if you want to, you can. And in some ways, you put your profile out into the market, which actually is a really extraordinary and fantastic way of saying, I, the customer, am using my data to get the best deal rather than the other way around. And it's been very, very empowering. I wonder whether you learned anything from the Estonian model as a real template for cross-departmental openness and consumer power.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting, Laura. Yes, and I think that, I mean, one of the very first recommendation out of the Royal Society report is that it's really important for government to lead the way on these issues. And so I absolutely agree that that's really important. And looking to models that have worked well elsewhere, of course, is always going to be a useful thing to do. I just wanted to actually pick up on the points though that we were just making, that you were just making around the connection between some of these social issues and some of these pathways to net zero, because of course you and I are both involved, as you said earlier, in the IPPR Environmental Justice Commission report, which is looking at many of these issues. And I think that one of the challenges is to look to see how we can roll some of these digital solutions out in a way that really is sensitive to that social context. So the really obvious example is around broadband. So we can't be expecting to be unless we've got good broadband access across the country, then we can't be expecting to be using these technologies. But Greg raised some of the important questions about the development of mobility as a service, or indeed heating as a service, for example. And we need to be looking at how we can be deploying those sorts of services in a way that does really, doesn't exacerbate social inequalities, but actually acts to help reduce them. And you could do these things in a good way or in a bad way. But similarly, actually, on the innovation piece, which again, obviously, Greg is a great example of innovation in this sector. But more generally, if we're looking to really unlock if you like, an innovation ecosystem around this is an area in which the UK has the potential to lead the world in terms of digital solutions around net zero. We need to be looking at enhancing looking to see how we can enhance that, how we can create kind of innovation clusters around the country, but doing so again in a way that helps with the broader levelling up agenda. There's just so many huge opportunities here for actually, if with a really sensible, coordinated strategy in terms of the policy framework and the investment, and especially as we're looking at in this period of trying to restructure our economy post COVID, there's a huge opportunity actually for connecting the dots here across those social problems, but then also that pathway to net zero at the same time as building a stronger economy into the future.
But I do also think that and Greg's point that your grandmother is obviously on Facebook, my mother who's 91 is on Twitter, etc. I mean, we aren't. In some ways, we do sometimes infantilize consumers and citizens. And if we enable and in some ways take away some of the barriers, digitalization should be able to reduce, fundamentally the carbon, but also the cost of services. I mean, we can see that right across the board in other sectors, but in energy, there's Greg, but also there's quite a lot of regulation that's actually inhibiting cost reduction and in many ways sort of optimization of business models. So I wonder whether we need to be, let's say, much more sort of open and trusting and respectful actually of customers. Your point about broadband, however, is I think it's become actually an essential service, and see that with education over COVID and stuff like that. But Emily, when you're looking at this from a sort of Cambridge, from your overview in Cambridge, digitalization, when we start to look really very much at the carbon side, rather than just the energy side, where do you see the great opportunities for a much more digitalized sort of infrastructure policy making and overall strategic planning?
Do you mean in terms of where digital technologies can help in?
Yes, and drive out carbon from the point of view of identifying those carbon keys as such.
Yeah, I mean, listen, we know that we've got to rapidly get every sector of society down to net zero. That's the challenge, right? Every sector of our economy, rather, well, and society. But I mean, if you can literally go through each of those different sectors and look to see where digital technologies can play a really significant role. So we've got Greg here as an example from the energy sector, although there are plenty of other ways in which digital technologies can also play a really important role. They're already being used in terms of optimizing wind farms, for example, the operation of wind farms, for example. If we look at the transport sector, well, I think we kind of know already that there's lots of opportunities. I've already been talking a little bit about mobility as a service as one particular opportunity in that sector. Agriculture we haven't spoken about so far, but there's already huge developments in terms of precision farming, looking to see how we can actually use digital technologies to help use fertilizers and other land management practices just more efficiently. If we look at the building sector, well, clearly we're already seeing advances in terms of building management systems, but actually it's more important than that. A building sector is one sector where you really need to be looking across the board and taking a very systems approach to decarbonising it. And if we can, it comes back to that interoperability and disclosure of data. If we can make sure that we've got the systems in place to really across the whole construction process in a systems way, assess the carbon emissions. So it's not just the operation of the buildings, it's also the construction of the buildings, and all, so you take into account the full emissions context, then you can start to make much better decisions. And then that links through to the regulators, because some of this is then tied into how you build the standards and the regulations, particularly important in that sector. If we're talking, there was mention earlier about greenhouse gas removal, and then that if we're looking to actually take greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere, which we're almost certainly going to need to do in the long term if we're going to really get to limiting warming to 1.5, then you can either go down a nature-based solutions route, in which case you need to be properly monitoring that again comes into digital technologies, or you're looking at technologies to try to remove those greenhouse gases, which there's some starting to come online, and again using digital solutions either in the development or operation of those technologies is another huge opportunity. So there's just so many different possibilities on the innovation side of things, where there's actually a really exciting space. We know there's huge developments in machine learning and AI at the moment, seemingly solving all the great scientific problems. Here is a really exciting opportunity to bring together both that excitement in terms of the new possibilities around digital solutions together with one of the greatest problems that society as a whole is addressing at the moment. So it's a very exciting kind of nexus to be in.
Could I add something,
Yes,
Laura, just to build on what Emily just said? Well, just because this is the topic that, when you talk about digitization of tech, we get ever so excited with a lot of the organizations we've been working with. But one thing that I think, Emily, you're sort of alluding to, which I think is an incredible, sometimes it's just one of those, one of those moments when you're like, oh, until someone says this, you don't really realize it. And you talk, Laura, about carbon keys. Someone's scope 3 in carbon emissions is another company's scope 2. And I think there is a low-hanging fruit there when we think about digitization of tech, is that, as Microsoft, we have 3 scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 of energy. And scope 1 is the energy, essentially when you burn fossil fuels yourself, right? The cars that your company uses, the natural gas that your buildings use. Scope 2 is around the energy the electricity you use to, utilize your office buildings and things like that. You plug your laptop in your office. And then scope 3 is always the biggest one, right? Because that's your supply chain. But if Microsoft, for example, if we look at our supply chain and the organizations we're using in there, we are thinking about how we can neutralize, but for Microsoft, we're looking to make this negative. How can we make our scope 3 negative? Well, if we are making our scope 3 negative and the business in scope 3 is making their business negative, we're kind of almost double negativing the energy for that company. And I think some people aren't necessarily making that connection. And I think there's lots of different organizations out there that can support other businesses. A couple of examples that I've just popped one in the IM window. Emily mentioned agriculture. That's where we're seeing a lot of innovation happen. So there's an organization called Cloud Agronomics, which is looking at how they can use not satellite imagery, but actual they actually fly planes to get imagery of the planet and of fields, and they're doing soil analysis to help with precision farming. And then you've got an organization in the UK called Agrometrics, which is trying to become the data marketplace for farmers. But then that also brings in the concept of trust and making sure that the data that these organizations use, the farmers giving them the data or the farmers utilizing that data, trust that organization. But I just kind of wanted to hang on Emily's point around every single industry can innovate here, and there are multiple different ways and they can do it. But if they were to do it in the guise of thinking, well, I am someone else's scope 3, actually we could make such a huge change. And yes, consumers can definitely impact what we're doing in this space, but to be perfectly frank, it's going to be businesses that need to start making these changes because of the different products that they build. We need to make sure that they're manufactured in the right way. But yeah, I do think if we could, that's the biggest thing for me that I'm starting to think about now, is how we connect businesses when they think, well, I'm your scope 3, but that's my own scope 2. How do I make that negative?
Greg, just on that, I mean, do you look at your supply chain and do you have procurement criteria on carbon?
I mean, we do, although, I mean, to be fair, fascinatingly, it's irrelevant in the context of what we do as a business. We power 1.8 million homes, 1.5 million of those use gas. The average household emits 2.7 tons of carbon a year from its gas heating, right? I kind of know where we need to put our focus. And I think fascinating, you know, for us, it's really clear what we need to do there. But the fascinating thing for me when I listen to, for example, a conversation about agriculture and cross-sectional stuff, is the way in which total system thinking enabled by true digitization at every level transforms everything. It inverts assumptions. All right, so very quickly, to give an example, electric vehicles are becoming the new normal. They're just better than petrol cars. And the costs are coming down precipitously. The cost of a battery has fallen 8-fold in the last 10 years, right? So you can go on Alibaba, and if you're allowed to be driven on the UK roads, you can find an electric saloon for $15,000 with 5 seats and a 250-mile range, right? We are rapidly emerging on the world where everyone's petrol car currently is their last petrol car. Never mind diesel. Now that creates this enormous well of use of electricity in the UK, but we don't have to charge those cars instantaneously. There's quite a lot of discretion when we charge them. Fantastic. That works brilliantly with wind power, because then you'll just fill the batteries when it's windy. So we build loads of wind power. Now, once we've got loads of wind power, the cost of green electrons starts to fall. We need a massively digital system to take advantage of these, to channel them at the cars that need them at the time. But that then makes electric heating become cheaper, because you've got all these cheap green electrons with zero carbon. Once you're doing that, and again, you can use a lot of time of use discretion through digital technologies. You say, well, how do we handle the fact that in winter, there are going to be 4 or 5 days when it's not windy? At least there's not very much wind. Fantastic. We build 4 times more wind generation than we need. By the way, there are other solutions are available. When you've got all that wind generation, people go like, oh no, that means most of the time you've got excess electrons. But they're like, these are green electrons. It doesn't matter. There's zero marginal cost. So then what you do is you go like, industries will, again, if it's digitized and people can grab them when they're cheap, the way that I grab, you know, yellow label stuff at Tesco when it's cheap. We're beginning to spot these whole new industries appearing in our customer base. So we've got a bunch of indoor farms. Now these are spectacular businesses, right? So basically they have a warehouse building inside on the outskirts of or inside a town or city. They're a sealed environment, so they need no pesticides. They have no air miles. So to get fresh tomatoes, you're not flying them halfway across the world. And then 99% of the water that goes into the building leaves in the fruit and veg. In fact, the only thing that's a problem for these businesses is energy. Today it's expensive and it's dirty. But if we're using all those other sources of advance in technology to drive down the cost and drive up the availability of green electrons, suddenly these in-house indoor farms are becoming economically viable, and they're carbon wonderful, and they're great for health and nutrition. So to me, that kind of compounding benefit where you open up whole new industries, or you transform industries no one would have thought of. So in the way that no one thought when the iPhone was launched, that was the end of, you know, the New York cab medallion. In the same way, you know, unlocking all these capabilities through technology, through the digitization of our energy system, creates the opportunity to make so much else better. And, you know, I think it's really exciting. I'm from Teesside, right? A place that we used to have make steel. In fact, the Sydney Harbour Bridge was built in Middlesbrough. All that's shut now, and it's shut partly because it's so carbon intensive. We've exported that carbon emission. But a green energy system actually starts to make this possible again. You can imagine a world in which, driven by digitization, the shifts at a steel factory are based around when it's windy, right? How cool is that going to be? So I think, you know, we're on the verge of a genuine green industrial revolution powered by the digitization of our grid, and it affects everything in ways people are not yet thinking about.
I totally agree. And I mean, there's a really interesting analysis about the zero marginal cost society. And actually, that's what's happened with data. And that's what's going to happen to electrons. And so the commodity isn't the value, it's what you do with it. And it's the added value. And I mean, Stephen, coming on to exactly how you see the future, because I know that you've got quite a lot of views around, in some ways, data trusts and ethical governance, and this issue about open data, which of course is one of our mutual interests. Because if, you know, Greg is talking about these huge opportunities, in some ways there's going to have to be some form of governance model or shape around that to actually enable it to be accessible, but in a way that's protective.
I really love listening to people be so excited about their ideas. I think it's brilliant. It makes me happy in life. And there are examples of it here today from Eva and Greg, where they've got businesses and they've got all the things they want to do with them to make the world better, and it's awesome. It's really nice. And that's really the underpinning. The reason why we like markets is because people with ideas can go and do stuff, and they can solve the world's problems. And when they do it right, people choose it and they take it and they run with it. And so when it comes to say, and this is really quite abstracted really, but when it comes to trusts and ethics and so forth, there is an underlying challenge, which is that dealing with anything that is societal, it's more than one person. It all boils down to everyone's interacting with one another. That's what's different between being on your own and being with other people. And that's why things like interoperability just keep coming up and up and up, because it's the mechanism in the case of digitalization for those social interactions, at least at a practical level. But the real challenges underneath, and the reason where regulation can be at its best, is the things in our society that I think of and treat of as national assets is the best language I can come up for it. Where there are certain things about our country or our world where it's just, there is only one copy of it. You can't have anyone come along with an idea and do it. So the prime examples that we're all very used to in the world are national parks. You can't duplicate them, you can't remake them. They're ours. We've only got one. We've got to make the most out of it and let everyone enjoy it. It's true for data as well. It's an asset, but there are certain types of data you can only get one source of. And so part of the need for our society to make it work for everybody is to make those data national assets available to all, so that people can have those lovely ideas and actually deliver them rather than just imagine them. And this is this is why we have economic regulation, but it's changing, which we talked a little bit about earlier. So that where do we need to regulate and where do we not need to regulate? And that's going to become an increasingly sophisticated question when it comes to data and digitalization topics. Where can markets do a great job because people have got ideas and they can run with it? And what basics do we need to enable for society's benefits? So getting to that availability of data, one of the real basic foundational points is what types of data are not privately owned for an individual's benefit or an organization's benefit, but actually part of society's. And if you can work out which those are and how much is the minimum you need to do with them to let the world loose, then that will be one of the basic building blocks to allowing challenges like net zero be solved. And certainly if you do that in the right way, looking at how can we make the most out of this asset rather than how can we make the energy system run, that points you to all of this cross-sectoral work of making sure that anyone can come along, pull all the different bits of data together that our world has available to it, make their idea real, and let customers choose whether they like it or not. And I think that we are not very mature as a human race, probably, at understanding that argument at the moment. And I think that we will all be better off for ongoing discussions around it, of working out where do we let markets loose, where do we let society come to an agreement about how to work with our unique foundational assets as a globe.
Laura, there's one other point with regard to regulation that hasn't come up so far, but was something that we mentioned in the Royal Society report, which was around the carbon proportionality, was one way which we put it in the report, of the technologies we're developing, and whether or not regulation has a role to play in some aspects of that. So one of the things that we highlighted in the report was blockchain technologies, something that actually you could, what we were talking about a minute ago about looking at supply chains, you might think that blockchain technologies would be ideal for looking at better tracking emissions through supply chains, for example. But a lot of those blockchain technologies are very energy intensive in themselves. And so making sure that whether it's technologies in that instance to help address net zero itself, or indeed, other uses of digital technologies more widely, making sure that we're not increasing ever more the emissions associated with those technologies, but instead making sure that those are being rolled out in a way, regulated in a way that we're ensuring that they're making a positive contribution towards net zero is also really important.
It's quite interesting you raise that, because the communication sector did something a bit naughty, because what they decided to do was to reduce their energy costs by increasing their customers' energy costs by moving functionality into the home. And so they started to make higher margins and look fantastic. However, customers did have to pick up the pieces. So I don't know, Eve, whether that is a something that you've heard, but it is important, this supply chain, and that we're actually tracking the carbon intensity. It isn't just passed. I have to say the energy sector is very good at passing risk from one party to another. So we don't want the party to take the risk as being the planet.
No, yeah, that is very frustrating. I can't comment on it directly because I wasn't aware of that particular situation, but many of the companies that I'm engaging with at the moment across the different sectors, they're not showing any desire to want to do that. They're not putting any desire to want to make the consumers pay for the changes that they need to make. Again, it might be that I'm working with quite forward-thinking organizations in this space, and it might be that there are some organizations that just need a little bit more kind of education in how they should be aligning themselves to this topic. But you know, there are a lot. I saw one of the questions in the IM, which is like, if any of the people that are on the call are a business that's trying to look into this and they don't want to go down the route of, okay, well, I need to increase my costs to a consumer to be able to make these changes. There are a number of kind of publications and support structures out there to help businesses think about, transitioning to net zero. One recently we announced our net zero pledge with 9 other organizations across different industries, where we're essentially saying we are going to create a mechanism between our 9 organizations, but then we're going to share our learnings, because that is the biggest issue in this space. Is if one person does it that way, Laura, and they say, right, I've created all of this net zero improvement at the cost of my consumers, we don't want people to replicate that. We want people to replicate a sustainable, ethical, transparent business. We don't want people to go the other way. So there are companies out there that are trying to do this in the right way, and we just need other businesses to kind of join that bandwagon. So I've popped a couple of resources in the IM window for those that are kind of looking to do it. We recently, literally yesterday, we announced that we've joined the Amazon pledge as well. So that's essentially saying there are businesses out there that will agree to the Paris Agreement and we will try and achieve it 10 years before we need to. So that's by 2040. So there are mechanisms to help.
Okay, Eve, we've got 4 minutes, and what I'd love from each of you is a very, very clear ask about what you want COP to deliver in terms of digitalization, whether it's an initiative or whether it be a clear recommendation. So Eve, why don't you kick off as your...
I knew you'd ask me to go first.
Sorry.
Well, my focus, it's okay. My focus is going to be COP needs to bring together true innovators in this space and create real-time action that we can see move the needle. In the UK and Europe, we are absolutely leading in the carbon net zero discussion. I would like COP to bring together true innovators in this space and make some clear actions and not just goals. I don't want people to keep saying we're going to try. I want COP to say we are going to do, or we have done. Action. There we go. That's my word.
Thank you. Very good.
I'll stick to home turf and say that we really need to set a hard expectation on the monopolies across society, that where we have regulated entities, we need an expectation that they look outwards to interoperate and join with one another, so that the monopolistic core to our society enables markets to solve all of our wider challenges.
Greg.
Look, I think the big thought thing for me, a thought exercise, is always, what if we'd never had fossil fuels? Right? We'd live in a cleaner, quieter, calmer world without climate change. Human ingenuity would still have created an advanced economy powered by energy. It would just be clean. And I think the thing we've done that unlocks that is we've created the opportunity to use large amounts of real-time data, so that electrons can be shifted around when they're available to where they're needed, charged accordingly, and then we can build systems that handle that. So really what we want to be doing is imagining a post-carbon society,
yep.
And then working backwards from that to where we are today. And digitization is the only way we'll make that work.
Edison's electric vehicle that never got made.
Teddy Roosevelt in 1902 was the first US president to do a public appearance in a car, and it was an electric car.
There you go. Emily, throw down the gauntlet to COP.
Well, so key thing about this COP is that this COP is where we shift from targets into implementation, right? That's the key, that's what we're wanting to achieve from this COP, actually getting on with it, of actually achieving these targets, right? And one of the key things around implementation is that we want, we need citizens to be involved in that. So one of the things that I think would be really amazing, that I could really see there being a role for digital technologies, is in terms of that democratization. So we've seen in the UK citizens' assemblies, and you and I, Laura, have been involved in citizens' juries as well, how important it is and how useful it is to get people engaged in shaping policies and in shaping the way in which we're going to be delivering net zero. If we could look to see how digital technologies could help enable that, not just at a national level, but at an international level, and we tie that into the COP process, then I think that could be really exciting. I've not heard anybody talking about that before, but I feel that there's a real role there that could be really exciting. And really, of course, this COP is going to be so much more virtual, as a consequence of the circumstances than ever before. And so, in any case, there is a real challenge about how do we achieve inclusivity, which is a key aim of the COP itself, in an environment that's going to inevitably be much more digital.
I just want to say thank you to a fantastic panel, and great to have so many people listening in this breakout group. Lots more to think about, and let's all ensure that COP delivers on all our dreams. There you are. Thank you very much indeed.